Right, so lastly, the chairman of the party, who always gives fantastic, insightful speeches, Jim Lewthwaite.
Thank you very much, Lawrence. And thank you, Alan, for putting me up, as I say. Right, well, I was specifically asked by Lawrence to speak about grooming gangs. I know I've spoken about it before, the phenomenon, but there's always more information out there. Essentially, what I'll be speaking about is one particular book, which as far as I know has got more material about grooming gangs up to the date of its publication, which was, this is the second edition of 2016. Peter McLoughlin, Easy Meat. I'll come to the reason why he calls it Easy Meat in a second. But you can't get it in Britain, as far as I know. You can't get it on Amazon, you can't get it at Waterstones. I had to have a friend of Mark Cottrell's import it from the publisher's New English Review Press in Nashville, Tennessee. Obviously, the establishment does not want you to know the contents of this book. I don't agree with its fundamental premise, which was that everything good that's happened about the revelation about the grooming gangs was caused by the EDL in 2009. Yes, exactly. And the BNP apparently were either non-existent, or if they were an influence on repressing grooming gangs, they were bad news, because nobody wanted to have anything to do with them. The name of Marlene Guest does not appear anywhere. And the fact that we passed a motion, tried to get a motion passed in Bradford Council condemning grooming gangs and demanding police action in 2005 doesn't get a mention. It never happened, apparently. Anyway, first of all, grooming gangs are back in the news because 6 of the Oxford grooming gang, I think unusually they weren't Pakistani Muslims, they were North African origin, were released, I think, on Friday, halfway through their sentences of 14 years. Most of us would expect them to have served the full sentence, given that the Oxford grooming gang trial was one of the most horrific. I think it was the transcripts and that stirred Elon Musk into saying, what the hell is going on here? So it was extremely significant, and most people would have thought they should, by definition, have served full sentences. 2 will not even be released on licence, which means they will not be supervised in any form or function. And given the incredibly remunerative aspects of grooming gangs, it's likely they will go straight back to what they know best how to do. So first of all, should we call it grooming gangs or rape gangs? I actually prefer grooming gangs because there is a specific mode which is unique to grooming gangs and also a scale of phenomenon. For me, a rape gang is something like the West Indian 15-man gang, the new Brixton Raiders, who abducted 2 white British girls at knife point from a bus stop, took them to an underground garage and raped them in 1991 for several hours, then walked away. They just wanted to satisfy their lust and to express their hatred, and then they walked away. Grooming gangs don't operate like that. They want a sex slave they can market for money, and the money is unbelievable. Mohammed Shafiq, one of the very few Muslims who's ever condemned grooming gangs, reckoned that a girl could be sold for a sex act for £200 or £300 back in about 2000 and something. I've got the date here somewhere. It's more of the nature of £600 or £900 now, and multiplied over the number of times the girl will be forced to carry that out under duress. A single girl during her usefulness as a child prostitute between, say, 10 and 15 can bring in tens of thousands of pounds overall. Multiply that by the fact that, for instance, a ratio of one gang of 3 brothers in Rotherham, this is very much a clan thing between brothers and uncles and cousins and so on, they were manipulating 54 girls over a period of about 6 years or so. Millions of pounds are being generated by the bodies of children. That also means it's just as useless as Keir Starmer's other promise to smash the gangs. We all know that when you smash a gang, another gang steps into its place because there's so much money to be made. How can you smash the Pakistani grooming gangs when another gang of Pakistanis will immediately take over? The latest statistics in Greater Manchester Police are, as revealed by an independent counsellor on GB News on Friday, 10 to 15% of the entire population of Oldham are being investigated for grooming offences. Now, half the population of Oldham are women. A substantial proportion will either be too young or too old. So multiply that 10 to 15%, well, first of all, double it to 20 to 30% of the male population of Oldham, and then subtract the very young and the very old, and then subtract the remnant white population, you realise that this is the majority of the Pakistani population. If you looked at the age group 18 to 24, I doubt you would find many who aren't listed. So we're talking about a phenomenon of considerable scale. Jenny Pierce, the professor of the University of Bedfordshire, who's looking into this, defines the grooming model for sexual exploitation as this: the process whereby an abusive adult entices a young person to becoming dependent upon them. Invariably, this involves the young person believing that they are in love with their abuser. The pattern moves through a process where the abuser flatters the young person, giving them attention, accommodation, other gifts, usually alcohol, drugs, being taken to sort of grown-up events and so on and so forth, convinces them that they're entering a sort of new adult world and that the person is in love with them. I'm departing from the text. The young person increasingly becomes dependent upon the abuser, who invariably isolates them from family and friends and encourages them to become reliant upon drugs and alcohol. What this means is that, for instance, they typically accuse the parents, who are desperately trying to intervene to save their daughter, of being racist, of being anti-Pakistani. And to a young kid that's been through Britain's school system, this is convincing, because that's what the teachers and the government and the MPs and the councillors are telling them too. So why wouldn't they believe it? Anyway, to return to the text. The abuser who invariably isolates them from family and friends and encourages them to become reliant upon drugs and alcohol. The young person is then forced or coerced into swapping or selling sex to raise money for the boyfriend. They become pimped out, and that process will continue until they become too old for the client's attention, which is usually about 15, 16. If you've read Sarah Wilson or Sammy Woodhouse or any other survivors, there's a slackening off period when the abuser ceases to be interested in them because they're beginning to get too old to be useful, and he dumps them. And then he moves on to a younger aged set of girls. We're talking about an industry. And that's why the government's feeble attempts to say it can be solved by localised grooming, one of many reasons why it's useless, is it's a national scale phenomenon. These girls are being traded from Rotherham to Plymouth and to Cumberland and to London and the rest of it. A local inquiry is not going to pick up all the connections of the trafficking. The other thing is there are international parallels. Exactly the same phenomenon happens in Holland. It's known as the lover boy phenomenon, and it's usually Moroccans or Turks. And there are hints that it's happening in Germany, but there the information is even more strictly controlled than in Britain, so you don't know about it. Now, the reason I don't agree with Peter McLaughlin's account is he simply says, what are the reasons for this? And he says it can be either Islam or culture. It doesn't seem to cross his mind that two things can be true at the same time. He goes for Islam. He says it's nothing to do with Pakistani culture, Pakistani rural culture, specifically Mirpuri culture, which isn't even technically speaking Pakistani. It's Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, and most Pakistanis look down on Mirpuris as the ultimate backwoods dregs, taught by imams who can barely speak Arabic and so on and so forth. As I say, that was Jenny Pierce, the University of Bedfordshire, which is one of the two universities which have specialised in this. There is also something called the Jill Dando Institute for Crime and so on. And two lecturers there, Ella, I think it's pronounced Cockbane, and Helen Brayley, give you a reason as to why it's not Islam, which Peter McLoughlin quite correctly dismisses out of court. Just listen to it. This is two British academics who are so sunk in political correctness that they say religion seems to be a red herring here, in that many of the offenders seem to be Muslim only in a nominal sense. Prior to arrest, many drank alcohol, took drugs, did not have beards, and all engaged in extramarital sex with underage girls. Hardly the hallmark of a strict Muslim. So you see, because these Muslims had sex with underage white British girls, it's nothing to do with Islam, is what these two authors are stating. Quite rightly, Peter McLoughlin said in that case the Crusades were not really about Christianity, because Christianity forbids the taking of life. So all those crusaders were on a red herring. It's just absolute nonsense, that as a dismissal of Islam being a factor. He then spends half the book giving you quotations from Sharia law. I didn't know till I read the book that a conference of Islamic scholars, I think at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the definitive place for the definition of Islamic jurisprudence, said that the UN Declaration of Human Rights was incompatible with Sharia law. Therefore, Sharia law should take precedence in the minds of every good Muslim. It says, for instance, rules about the status of women, the use of alcohol, usury, etc., incompatible with Sharia law. Therefore, all good Muslims should ignore human rights laws and adhere to Sharia law, which of course means that they're in conflict with British law from the start. So when is a government going to say, if you are basically saying my religion forbids me from respecting UN law, or for that matter, British law, because it's incompatible with my religion, you're not welcome here? I mean, we're basically saying you are above the law, outside the law does not reflect on you. And the hatred with which this is expressed, I'll just give a single paragraph reading from a defendant in a Rochdale grooming gang trial. This is a defendant in the dock. And when he's found guilty, he then turns around to the court and says, we are the... unusually, I think these Rochdale people, I think they were Pakistani in this instance. We are the supreme race, not those white bastards, pointing to police officers in court. You will not get a CBE for this. You were born 1,000 years too late. You F-worded my community. You destroyed my community and our children. So we're accused of destroying Pakistani children by giving them British ideas, you see. You destroyed my community and our children. None of us did that. White people trained those girls. This is the white British child victims of the grooming gang. White people trained those girls to be so much advanced in sex. They were coming to it without hesitation to Rochdale, Oldham, Bradford, Leeds and Nelson and wherever. What he's accusing the British state of doing is that they groomed these children to be prostitutes and then sent them into Muslim cities so that they would corrupt Muslim morals. And that's the leader of the grooming gang saying, it's not my fault, it's your fault because it's your children and you trained them up to be prostitutes, not me. They were coming without hesitation to Rochdale, Oldham, Bradford, Leeds and Nelson, whatever. He said the jury in Liverpool has been taking instructions from BNP leader Nick Griffin and later pointed to the prosecutor, Rachel Smith, saying, I curse you at night. I curse you and your family. I curse the juries. You will all understand, pointing at Judge Hockar, presumably a Muslim himself, doesn't sound like a very white British name, pointing at Judge Hockar, I curse you, I curse the jury, I curse the media and most of you bastards. Your families will get it. So if that isn't hatred and a revenge syndrome, I don't know what is. But if you stand back from all that and say, is that just Islam? No, it's Islam plus Mirpuri village clan politics, plus a profound sense of hatred. Now, we are letting these people into our country who openly express hatred for us and our laws and our institutions, our judges and our juries and our prosecutors and our police, and say, we curse all of you. So what are they doing here? I mean, the case for deportation couldn't be stronger. I want to go over one other phenomenon of the scale of the phenomenon. When the first edition of this book suggested it might be 10,000 victims, Peter McLoughlin was just laughed at and mocked by the media for being anti-Islamic and the rest of it. Later on, he calculates that Pakistanis are 170 times more frequent, more likely to commit these crimes than a white Briton, as a sort of reference point. He then points out that there were probably more like 2,000 than 1,400 victims in Rotherham by 2014, when the J report and the Casey reports were coming out. If you remember that Rotherham is 1/250th of the British population as a whole, and that it has quite a low percentage of Muslims, about 3% rather than 5%, it comes out that if you multiply through by 250 the 2,000 victims, it's 500,000. Sarah Champion, the later Labour MP for Rotherham, who took over after the ghastly Dennis McShane, who said he didn't know anything about it. He didn't know it. He was 18 years MP for Rotherham. He said, I didn't know there was any grooming going on. But then, of course, he was deeply involved in defrauding the taxpayer of various items at the time, so he might have been on other things. Like Keir Starmer, he can only think about one thing at a time, you know. But anyway, Sarah Champion suggested that she thought there were more likely to be 1 million child victims so far, and growing by the day. And that was a Labour MP for one of these towns. Remember, Rotherham has a low Pakistani population. It's the 56th borough in terms of size in Britain, and much larger targets have been ignored. When I spoke to Andrew Norfolk, who of course we'll come to in a minute, he said, when is there ever going to be a trial, a big trial in Bradford and Keighley? It's got the biggest Pakistani Muslim population of the country. When is there going to be a trial? I said, well, we didn't get very far with our motion. I've no reason to believe that West Yorkshire Police or Bradford Council are going to be any different. That was some years ago. Just recently, Bradford Council was asked to conduct a local inquiry, and they refused point blank. We all know why, because Labour councillors were more than anything else responsible for the cover-up. So we've got an industrial-scale sex traffic. We've got an industrial-scale cover-up. What you get is bursts of activity in the press and prosecutions, and then long periods of silence. How far back does grooming go? Well, it was definitely underway in the 80s, because the very first victims of the groomers were actually Sikhs. And Sikhs didn't respond. I've put an article on the website recently pointing out you can't fight the third world with first world methods. We assume, judges, juries, police, all the rest of it, we behave in a first world manner. It's not working, and it won't work, because you can't smash the gangs with the police alone. And the community is not on your side, because when these people are released back into the community, they're not shunned, they're not ostracised, they're welcomed back into their families. Their families attend the trials and jeer and boo at the defendants, the plaintiffs, the girls. They ring the girls at night and threaten them with death. One girl in 2008 had her tongue nailed to a table. That's repeated by 2 authorities. She had her tongue nailed to a table for going to the police. They're threatened with having their houses burned down with their families inside them. That has happened in a number of cases, a number of unexplained fires, are girls and their families being burned alive. So we know this is going on. Anyway, what happens is there's spurts of activity and then periods of silence. The Sikhs have been groomed for years by Muslims, and in as early as 1988, there was fighting between Muslims and a Sikh gang called Sher-e-Punjab in Wolverhampton about grooming. Basically, the Sikhs responded to the Muslims the way they would have done in India. They got their knives out, they turned up, and they had numerous stabbings. One Sikh was carrying a sawn-off shotgun. They basically said, if this is what you're going to do to our girls, we're going to fight back the way we know best. And they formed a gang called Sher-e-Punjab that hunted down the groomers and attacked them physically. There's been further outbreaks of violence between Sikhs and Muslims in 2001, in Derby, 2010 in Luton. In 2013, Sikhs stormed a restaurant, the Mughal Durbar in Leicester, which was being used as a centre of grooming activity. And guess who was sent to prison? The Sikhs. The Muslim groomers were let off scot-free. Not one was charged with anything. but the Sikhs got substantial prison sentences for the crime of trying to rescue one of their daughters who was held captive there, and for taking on the groomers with the only weapons they knew best, knives and swords. That was a clear warning. If you try to fight back against the Muslims, the police will side with the Muslims because there's more Muslims than Sikhs and we want to be on the winning side. It's as cynical as that. Just as in Bradford, they were afraid of riots. So the Sikhs formed the Sikh Awareness Society and basically distributed literature and films and warnings to their girls. There are examples given, actual photos in the book. A Sikh Awareness Society poster says, "Watch out, Muslims in your neighbourhood are issuing instructions backed by the Quran, backed by Sharia law, saying good Muslims must seduce Sikh girls and convert them to Islam if necessary at the point of a knife." What they actually do is they rape them, they photograph the rape, they then say, "We're going to send this to your family and your Gurdwara if you don't comply and become a sex slave." That's how dirty it is, and that's why the Sikhs have no time for them. But that was right back in 1988, and the Sikh Awareness Society was formed in 1998. In Britain, it was dead quiet until about the late 2000s, but at least one Lancashire woman police officer said recently that she knew of such activity in the 1970s. Sue Reed of the Daily Mail rang me recently and said she knew about it in the 1970s because she was at school in Preston and it was going on. But the first big development was around 2003-04. In 2003, Channel 4 wanted to put out a documentary called Edge of the City about grooming gang activity in Keighley, which is 1/5 of the Bradford Metropolitan District. Word got out, and Anne Cryer, the Labour MP, became involved. Now, she admitted that she'd known about it for many more years before this documentary, but the documentary forced her to do something. She admitted that she'd been to the mosques and to community leaders in 2003, but they'd refused to condemn grooming. Then, United Against Fascism and the Muslim Council of Britain and various other people piled in and told her to shut up about it. And furthermore, the police and... just a minute, I'm just searching for my place. That's right, that one. Groups such as Unite Against Fascism, the 1990 Trust, the National Assembly Against Racism, began to flood Channel 4 with requests to delay transmission. Now, they were going to transmit this programme 3 weeks before the local council elections in 2004. They planned to put it out in May 2004. Colin Cramporn, as mentioned here, made sure they didn't. It was postponed until August and transmitted late at night when they hoped that nobody would watch it. In fact, 2 million people did. So, to continue, the Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, Colin Cramporn, joined the call and Channel 4 caved in. Now, the interesting background to this is the producer of the film, Anna Hall, knew about grooming for years before she started doing the programme in 2003. She was informed by Sarah Swan, who was running a campaign called, on behalf of Dr. Bernardo's, the charity, a campaign called Streets and Lane in Bradford. Now, the interesting thing about this is it goes back to 1995, when the government gave $750,000 to an obscure Bradford charity run by Dr. Bernardo's to address something which wasn't meant to be happening in the first place. Dr. Bernardo's made no publicity whatsoever about what was going on. But secret reports within Bernardo's, which have been sort of captured, in 2006 said they were all discussing the phenomenon of online grooming and street grooming and so-called localised grooming. They knew about what was going on in Bradford as far back as 1995. Since then, Sue Reed has got in contact with me and said that Dr. Bernardo's, and this is what shocked me, were complicit. They weren't just... They were meant by the government. They were given $750,000 to mop up the child victims, to make sure they sort of got onto the straight track and that they were looked after, which meant that there must be something going on. So the government, this was the Cameron government, knew in 1995 that something was going on. across in Rotherham, they knew that something was going on in 1995, 1996, because they set up a parallel charity called Risky Business, headed by the hopeless Jane Senior, who you may have heard of. But anyway, back in 1995, 30 years ago, the government knew enough to set up give these charities money to cope with a phenomenon which they were denied was happening in the first place. Yet, although Sarah Swan knew about this, she told Anna Hall of Channel 4 in 1996, but Anna Hall was afraid to do anything till 2003. And then when she tried to do something, Unite Against Fascism, the Muslim Council of Britain, Bradford Council, South Yorkshire Police all leapt on them. Now, not mentioned in this book is that 4 Bradford councillors were elected in 2004, and that we passed a motion in 2005 demanding that Bradford Council do something about grooming. It was defeated by 96 votes to 4 because the Conservatives who were in charge, Labour, Lib Dem and Greens all voted it down. And under Section 19, because it was voted down under Section 19, it was never even discussed. So we were never given an opportunity to present facts and figures. We've been inundated with social workers and low-level policemen saying you must do something about this. Tory councillors would admit that something was going on, but saying it's more than my job's worth to do anything. So the council voted it down. In 2005, Bradford Council and the West Yorkshire Police issued a statement, there is no grooming going on in Bradford District, despite the film. And they then wound up, in 2005, West Yorkshire Police wound up the specialised anti-grooming unit, shut it down, saying, since there was no grooming, there was no need for any police activity. You then get a long period when the media ignore it, although there are little whispers here and there. In 2008, there was a Panorama documentary, but it didn't mention Asian groomers, and it didn't mention white victims. It just said there was a problem with child prostitution in bits of the country, but nothing about who was doing what to whom. There were other sort of little drips and drabs of information, but the level of prosecutions was something like 1 a year. Then you get Andrew Norfolk coming out in 2011, January 2011. He came out with the statement that there were grooming on a massive scale up and down the country from police files, which he'd got access to. In other words, he was using information which already existed, but nobody had bothered to collate. And then the floodgates opened. He actually named Rotherham as being one of the worst cases, where if you read any of the victims' accounts, South Yorkshire Police and Rotherham Council were absolutely up to their neck in mischief. After all, the deputy leader of Rotherham Council was also the vice chair of the Crime and Police Commission, and he was a cousin of the leading groomer in Rotherham, who later murdered Laura Wilson for bringing shame on his family when she went to his house and shouted, "You bastard, you made me pregnant." So he and his brother stabbed her 40 times, cut her throat. You'll understand the significance of the throat cutting. It says basically, you're no different from a sheep that we execute at Ramadan with a throat. If she'd been stabbed 40 times, she was dead. But the throat cutting is obviously symbolic. It's, I treat you like a sheep or a goat at Eid. And then they tipped her in the canal. And still, the South Yorkshire Police took days to search the canal, despite the fact that eyewitnesses said the body's in the canal. I mean, they couldn't have done more to impede obstructions, to impede and obstruct the whole phenomenon. That all happened about 2011, 2012, and it was in 2011 that Jack Straw, Member of Parliament for Blackburn, said this: there is a specific problem which involves Pakistani heritage men who target vulnerable young white girls. We need to get the Pakistani community to think much more clearly about why this is going on and be more open about the problems that are leading to a number of Pakistani heritage men thinking it's okay to target white girls in this way. These young men are in Western society. In any event, they act like any other young men. They're fizzing and popping with testosterone. They want some outlet for that, but Pakistani heritage girls are off limits, and they're expected to marry a Pakistani girl from Pakistan, typically. So they then seek other avenues, and they see these young women, white girls who are very vulnerable, some of them in care, who they think are easy meat. Hence the easy meat quotation on this book. But all Jack Straw was saying is what he knew for a fact as MP for Blackburn and what Dennis McShane and every other Labour MP in the North should have known about. Incidentally, Simon Danchuk, on a GB News programme recently, said that in 2008, no less than Gordon Brown issued an edict that Labour-run councils and councillors should not investigate grooming gangs. Now, you'd have thought that would make headline news on any sort of media, on the papers or on the TV. Yet I haven't heard a word spoken since. Somebody has hushed that up. If it really led to 10 Downing Street, we should know about it. But somebody somewhere has said to all the newspapers, hush about Gordon Brown and a possible prime ministerial edict. Anyway, as I say, there was then another outburst of activity. Andrew Norfolk was forced to start publishing these accounts of grooming, which he'd known about since 2003. Then you got a demand for the House of Commons Select Committee on Child Protection to investigate it. You got the Alexis J report. You got the Louise Casey first report, which declared Rotherham Council unfit for purpose and caused the entire council to resign and be replaced by commissioners. Am I outstaying my welcome with the Hall?
No, you're okay for a bit.
Okay, I'll just wrap up then. So there was a burst of activity around 2011 to 2015, articles pouring forth in newspapers. But by 2015, the newspapers ceased to publish accounts and the prosecution level had dropped. Once again, back to sort of like one prosecution a year. Since then, of course, we've had the activity caused by Elon Musk discovering about the Oxford grooming gang trials, and we've had Charlie Peters on GB News reporting. But in between each burst of activity, everything goes to sleep again, the police stop investigating, the prosecutions drop off, and the groomers get let out on early release after having served only a few years, and presumably go back to grooming because it's such a profitable activity. So the question you have to ask yourselves is, will we ever get anywhere, even if we had a national inquiry, and I'm in favour of a national inquiry like most people in this room, will it be followed through by genuine police and other activity to arrest, imprison and deport the offenders? And if this is done, will they not then just be replaced by another generation? Because, as I say, I disagree with Peter McLaughlin's account that it's just about Islam. It's about Islam, it's about rural Pakistan, and it's also about indifference on the part of the British public, that they get bored after a few years and want to read something else. So a long-term solution has got to be more drastic, more fundamental than just locking up the individuals. What Peter McLoughlin basically in saying it's all Islam goes past is, no, it's a lot of it is about rural Pakistani culture. Should these people ever have been let in? Did anybody think about the consequences of letting them in? They were hired by Bradford Mills, typically, as cheap labour, people who would work for a pittance in a mill overnight on clapped-out machinery that should have been replaced by modern, up-to-date machinery that didn't need a huge workforce. The mill owners preferred to import cheap labour from an obscure part of the third world rather than buy quality machinery, which would have given jobs to British producers of that machinery. But it was a cheaper solution to bring in so-called cheap labour, which is not cheap at all because if each one of them brings in 5 dependents, well, the cost for education, the NHS and the rest of it means they're not cheap. They're cheap to the importing mill. They're not cheap for the rest of us, but these people are out of control. Thanks. I'm not going to bore you for much longer, but at the end of the day, we have to look at the Sikhs. They have been much more successful than us. First of all, by the threat, if you do this to our girls, we'll come around with knives and chop you up. I'm not suggesting violence, obviously, but the Sikhs gave a robust response, the sort of response the Pakistanis would have encountered if they tried it on in India. Basically, it's tribe against tribe. And the understanding there is we won't even try doing this because we know what the other lot will do to us in revenge. In this country, people know they're dealing with soft targets. They're dealing with people who won't fight back in that way and whose police and MPs and councillors and all the rest of it are too cowardly to even contemplate fighting back. So it's an unequal struggle unless we change our methods. These people would understand if we said, You don't mess with our girls. We're going to be just like the Sikhs. We can fight back too, the way you would expect in your country if you'd stayed there. That's why you're doing it here and not there on the same scale, because we're a soft touch. But at least we could have something like the Sikh Awareness Society. There was a programme prepared for transmission to all schools in 2008, warning girls of grooming gangs. It was suppressed. The Home Office pulled it. It only was trialled in a few schools in Sheffield, and then it was pulled. In Holland, it was transmitted. I mean, My Dangerous Lover Boy, it was basically an Anglo-Dutch collaboration. The Dutch put it out in every school in Holland. Watch out for groomers. This is how they behave. Be suspicious of men offering you sweets, vodka, chocolates, whatever. They could be trying it on. In this country, Home Office officials decided it was too hot to handle and pulled it. What does that tell you about the response from the state and from unnamed civil servants lurking in the background, the people Michael Gove called the blob? Yeah. It tells you why we are regarded as a soft touch. And it is happening in this country. It wouldn't happen on the Indian subcontinent at the same scale, because they know that the reprisals would be more than they could possibly get out of it. They know that that force would be met with force. Here, they know that force will be met with flabby civil servants, indifferent police, useless councillors, useless MPs like Dennis McShane, and so on and so forth. So as I say, I'm glad that you all applauded Marlene Guest. I'd like you to applaud her one more time, but nowhere in this book or any other book is her name mentioned.